Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting talk from the Oxford Guild with our Collegium Global Network and our partner societies from leading universities. We're honored today to be hosting the special online event with a truly esteemed guest, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is a world-renowned economist and foremost expert and leader in sustainable development, macroeconomics, and the fight against poverty. He has been a special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General from 2001 to 2018, including most recently around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to being a best-selling author, he's been recognized by Time as one of the 100 most influential people in the world twice. And over the past 30 years, he has advised countless heads of state and government on economic policy and strategy worldwide, including being a senior advisor to the likes of the WHO, World Bank, and IMF, amongst many others. You're all in for a real treat in this session, and thank you so much again, Professor Sachs, for taking the time to join us and share your insights. Over to you, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Abbas, and thanks to everybody. I hope you're doing well at home or wherever you are, and it's good to be with you, though it would be really nice to be together face-to-face in Oxford, and I hope we can do that sometime soon. It is obviously not an exaggeration to say that we're living in the most extraordinary time in modern history. I'm a bit older than you are, so I have a few more years that I can put that to, and I can say in the almost 50 years since I started as an undergraduate in 1972, there's nothing like our current moment. The dislocations because of the epidemic itself, the economic shocks that are accompanying those dislocations, the geopolitical shocks that are also roiling in these events, and though were already present beforehand, are being made more tense by them. The technological change that's underway, like our meeting right now, the digitalization of the economy under the pressures of the pandemic, all add up to something that we have not seen before. And I think it's right to say, as UN Secretary General Guterres did, that this is the biggest global crisis since World War II. I can say as an economist that it's definitely the biggest economic dislocation since the Great Depression. It simply is much larger and more significant than the 2008 financial crisis, for example, or really anything that we have seen in peacetime since the Great Depression. So what does it all mean? It means that anything I say is surely going to be wrong in some significant part, and we're living through unpredictable times as well. A lot of the outcomes of these events are going to depend on the epidemic itself. So I think the first point to say is that there's a lot of uncertainty about how the virus and the transmission is going to play out. In some sense, we're still in an early stage of this epidemic. At most, only a few percent of the world population has been infected, and we hope it stays that way. In an uncontrolled epidemic, if this were just to continue in a basically uncontrolled manner, we would expect well over half of the world to experience an infection along the way, and a lot of deaths to follow that. Nobody knows exactly what the infection fatality rate is. That is the rate of fatalities following an infection, but it's probably somewhere around 0.5% to 1% of all infections, though it varies, of course, by age, it varies by location, varies by income, varies by health system, and therefore it's not a single concept, but it's a lot. And somewhere on average, around 1% probably of all those who are infected. And that means that If this were an uncontrolled epidemic, of the 7.8 billion people on the planet today, we might expect 5 billion or more to experience an infection ultimately. And that would mean, with a 1% fatality rate, 50 million deaths from this virus. Thanks God it's not uncontrolled, but it's not very well controlled. And there is prospect for a vaccine, which could, if we are very, very lucky, bring this epidemic to a more decisive end. So where we stand right now is that the epidemic spread everywhere in the world, as you know. The UK and the US, where many of you are and where I am, we've had terrible spread of the virus and very high mortality rates, and on the whole, very, very poor leadership from this very late response by government, and I would say not a great response by the public either, in terms of having a clear insight as to how to behave to keep the infection rates down. In general, Western Europe and North America, that means Canada, the US, and Mexico, we've done about the worst in the world, which is a little surprising because this is the richest corner of the world, but hardly the best performing in containing the pandemic. The Asia Pacific has vastly outperformed the North Atlantic in containing the pandemic. China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, and Vietnam, Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia have all kept the spread of the virus much more decisively under control, and the death rates much, much lower than what has been experienced in Europe and the United States. Our death rates are 300 or 400 or 500 per million population to this date, whereas in the Asia Pacific, it's about 100th of that, somewhere around 3 or 4 or 5, not 300, 400, or 500 per million population. So this by itself conveys two major points. One is the pandemic is controllable through behavioral change, through public health, physical distancing, wearing face masks, and so forth. Second, our part of the world, in the North Atlantic, we're not controlling the epidemic, whereas the Asia Pacific is controlling the epidemic. The huge drama, of course, day to day now is where it's going to spread. Most of the Americas are in a disaster because the leadership also is very poor. We have little Trumplets throughout much of Latin America, especially in Brazil, where I'd say Bolsonaro is absolutely irresponsible, reckless individual in the same image of Trump, who is definitely the worst president we've ever had in US history. But Bolsonaro is doing an awful job. López Obrador in Mexico, a very poor job. And the result is that the Americas are experiencing pretty much an outright pandemic with mass deaths, spreading virus, little control. There's big drama, of course, in Africa and India, two much poorer regions where the epidemic is not completely out of control, partly because the virus arrived later in these regions. And so the governments could see to take action soon after the arrival of the virus. But because these are very poor regions and people need to be out for their daily lives and livelihoods, controlling the epidemics in Africa and in South Asia are very tenuous, difficult propositions. And I should say in South Asia, while India is right on the borderline between control and out of control, the virus is probably not under control in Pakistan. And in Bangladesh, it's also quite uncertain. So a hugely populous region right at the borderline of control or not control. Well, I mention all of this because where the world's going to go depends on whether we continue to have a spreading virus for years or whether there is more decisive control. And I would say the balance of probabilities at this point is that we are not containing the epidemic. And therefore, the disruptions, the dislocations, the humanitarian crises, the potential for geopolitical instability is very, very large. As I mentioned, every day we hear a story that maybe a vaccine is about to be launched at massive scale that's going to save the day. Could be. There are more than 100 laboratories and companies working rapidly on the vaccine. There is some news of neutralizing antibodies being successfully proven in phase 1 or phase 2 trials or in animal models of the vaccine. But history shows that there's a big difference of getting these early results and actually having a vaccine that reaches billions of people in an effective, safe, and rapid way. So I'm trying to balance between the fact that science is enabling faster development of a vaccine, and a lot of money is flowing into it, and a lot of good effort is flowing into it. And Oxford has one of the lead candidates, of course, as you know well, with the fact that history has shown over and over again, don't count on it until it's there. And vaccine development is really an empirical proposition to a large extent. It may or may not work, these candidates, and they may or may not be safe, and they may or may not be scalable, and they may or may not be that effective. So my overall conclusion is, well, of course, there's a reason to hope for some success. We should also be cautious in expecting any kind of quick success, and should be emphasizing as much as possible the non-vaccine routes to control. All of this said, I expect dislocations for some time to come, certainly throughout next year, and possibly for years to come. In which case, this is going to be a very complicated and increasingly complicated crisis. The economics are bad. The amount of economic pain being felt is very deep and very unequal. So we're seeing both rising inequalities of income, because generally work that can be done online, such as you're continuing your coursework, does continue. People get paid. The online economy continues, but the frontline person-to-person economy is profoundly disrupted, especially in service industries that are often major employers and major employers of lower skilled or lower paid workers. And so we're seeing a huge divide in the life experience of this epidemic between those who have and those who don't. And those who don't are losing jobs, losing incomes, and losing lives to a much greater extent. So we're seeing a vast increase of inequalities. And as I've described, those could be inequalities across regions of the world as well as within countries. We're obviously seeing an amazingly rapid digitalization of economies. And we were trying to figure out what that meant before the epidemic, because we were increasingly shifting to e-everything, to e-commerce, e-governance, e-payments. Now we have almost immediate shift to e-office work, to telemedicine, to e-education, and so on. And so we've been thrown headlong into radical digitalization in recent months. And I think that this means that many of the tens of millions of jobs being lost will not recover. We just won't go back to old ways of doing things. There will be radical change in office work, which will become much more substantially work from home. Radical change in commerce, which was already underway, to be much more e-commerce, which has deep efficiencies added to it, but which means that our retail economy, which is a major employer, will shrink. Our use of land in cities for office space will drop. Construction will decline. We're definitely going to see major changes in how the world economy works as a result of this, and our own local economy. So those are likely to be disequalizing, but also with some very positive benefits as well. And reduced commuting time and possibly higher quality of life, if this can be worked out in a way which is equitable and sensible, which we're not so good at doing. So the economic dislocations will be persistent and large. And then finally, let me just mention the geopolitical dislocations coming from this. Again, before the epidemic, it was commonplace to talk about the rise of Asia, or the shift of the world economy towards Asia. And I believe that this crisis accelerates that change, in part because the Asia-Pacific region has done better and is more effective at facing crises like this. So it simply is the case that Asian economies are recovering apparently faster, sooner, more strongly than Europe and the United States. This is not for sure. China has had some dozens of cases in the last few days, which caused a reversal of the opening in Beijing, for example. That could be a harbinger of more trouble, though what it also shows is how rapid the response is in China to suppress the new outbreaks and control the epidemic in a far more direct and decisive manner than anything we see in the UK or the United States, for example. And in the US, we've, by the way, basically given up on control because we have an idiot president and no policy to actually keep anything under control. So I think that the geopolitical shift towards Asia is likely to be accelerated. The United States was already trying to block China's rise, and everything in recent months in US policy, to the extent that we have any policy, has been to pile on against China, to blame China for the virus, to claim, I think falsely and without evidence, but can't be sure, but still the charge is striking, that this is not a natural event, this virus, but is a release from a Chinese laboratory. I think it's basically a scurrilous charge, typical of the US, but maybe true. But in any event, the US is piling on. And most consequentially, the US is trying to cut the lifelines of advanced semiconductors to the Chinese economy, thinking that this is how the US really will defeat China's technological rise. I want to say that I don't think any of this will work to contain China, but I do think it makes the world even a more dangerous place than all of the economics and public health crisis would by themselves do. So I would add a geopolitical crisis to the pandemic and economic shocks. Let me add on, just for completeness, that we're obviously in a massive social crisis as well. In the United States, a crisis because of the continuing and pervasive racism in American society, the rising inequalities in the United States, and the explosion of social tensions prompted by Donald Trump. And so this adds to this great sense of instability. I'll close by saying that when I was a student a long time ago, the book that we read about the Great Depression was a fantastic study by a wonderful economic historian, Charles Kindleberger, who wrote a book called The World in Depression, and I would recommend it till today, where Kindleberger's argument was that the Great Depression was as deep as it was and as cataclysmic as it proved to be because there was no clear global leadership in the 1930s, and there was no collective leadership in the 1930s. Kindleberger's argument was that the British Empire had really ceased its global leadership role, and the United States had not picked up its leadership role that it would assume after World War II. So there was a kind of interregnum between the UK and the US. And in that gap, the Great Depression not only became very deep and grave, but gave rise to Hitler and to World War II. I would say that we are in a Kindleberger moment in this way, in that there is no leadership right now globally. We're not in between the US and China. I don't think China will become the global leader. I think we are in between US leadership such as it was, and I wasn't a fan of it most of the time, but US role and some kind of true multipolar system of cooperation. We don't have cooperation. The US obviously is not only not leading, it is attacking the foundations of a multipolar world. And so everything that I've said, whether it's about controlling the pandemic, fighting the economics, trying to promote a basis for peaceful cooperation, even getting a vaccine developed and deployed around the world, all of this is greatly weakened by the absence of global cooperation. So I'm trying to spend my days on these issues, partly to help in any way that I can think of to make a more effective public health response to the pandemic, but also to help create better foundations for a cooperative recovery from the pandemic, cooperative politically and economically. If we can't make that kind of cooperation, we're going to be in a deepening crisis and an increasingly dangerous one. So let me pause there and turn it back over to you, Abbas.
Thank you so much for that, Jeffrey. Really, really fascinating stuff. I'm sure nobody is going to be surprised. We've had absolutely tons of questions coming in.
Good.
Might as well get to it and start with the first one, which has come from Divya, doing environmental change and management at Oxford. And Divya asks, do you think that 5 years on, the UN Sustainable Development Goals have delivered the targets that the framework set out to do?
Well, we've delivered targets, but not achievements, which is a different thing. The idea of the Sustainable Development Goals was to create a shared global framework for sustainable development. And sustainable development means, in the term of art of the UN system, economic development that is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. So it is a triple bottom line concept that we should have continued economic progress, social inclusion, or as the UN puts it, leave no one behind, or as I would put it, achieving the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and achieving the major environmental objectives, which are to stop human-induced climate change, to stop the destruction and loss of biodiversity, and to control human pollutants, all three of which are massive environmental crises. So the SDGs, taken together with the Paris Agreement, which was reached also in December 2015, is a framework for global cooperative action. And I am working day by day on the SDGs. Are they delivering? No. They don't deliver by themselves. They're not self-executing. Adopting them doesn't make them happen. 5 years on, are they still shared goals of the world? I would say yes, with the exception of the United States, primarily because Trump is, without doubt, an enemy of sustainable development for lots of reasons, but it's just disastrous. And for most of the world, the SDGs and the Paris Agreement remain the shared framework. But how much progress do we really have towards these objectives, which include objectives of ending poverty and hunger, objectives of universal health care and universal access to education, objectives of decent jobs for all, and objectives of decarbonizing the energy system? Well, the answer is we weren't doing very well before COVID. Now it's a disaster because COVID will make worse just about everything, with the partial exception of greenhouse gas emissions, which have gone down, at least in the short term, because of the decline of overall economic activity. So the SDGs were not really all that effective. There weren't specific global initiatives that one could say, they're really implementing the SDGs. They weren't useless because they were also taken more and more as guideposts for how government should orient and plan. And that, I can tell you, is also real, in that as I work with governments around the world, they use the SDGs as a framework. But definitely this pandemic is a fundamental setback. Poverty will rise, hunger will rise. 2 billion children are out of school, some online, most not. Of course, the health crisis is self-evident, and it's not just COVID-19, but many other diseases now, which will actually have their own smaller epidemics, because even basic processes such as immunization have been set back. Mass unemployment, so the opposite of SDG 8. Oh, not good. This is really tough. I think the glimmer of hope in all of this is that there's a worldwide discussion among policy communities and activists that we're going to need a recovery plan. And that recovery plan should be based on the precepts of sustainable development and the Paris Agreement. So we should build back green, for example, build back fair, build back inclusively. And so when you have a huge crisis like this, you do have an opportunity for rebuilding in a more desirable way. And while that's not exactly the silver lining of this crisis, it is the opportunity that is very real from this crisis, that we need serious new plans of action for how to get out of this mess based on the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. And a lot is happening in that regard in the UK, in the European Union, in the Belt and Road Initiative, in China, in Korea, in the African Union, and with President Biden's administration, the Green New Deal in the United States. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Okay, got another question here coming from Michael, doing English at Cambridge. Michael asks, do you think this, I presume referring to the pandemic, everything that's going on, this will lead to a political change away from conservatism and nationalism globally? You mentioned little Trumplets across the world. Is their time up?
Let's hope. It should be. The worst performers in this epidemic are the populists, the nationalist, populist, supremacist types, Trump being number one. The guy is just god-awful. He's an idiot. He's a psychopath, in my opinion. He's dangerous, and we have probably about 120,000 dead or more, if you count properly, from this pandemic. A lot of that death at the hands of the President of the United States, because it's his job to make sure that there's an effective public health system working. He's incapable of that. He's incapable of it intellectually. He's incapable of it ideologically. He's incapable of it psychologically. And so this is really just a roiling disaster. But if you look, it's not coincidental, as I said, that Bolsonaro, who is the Trump of Brazil, same thing. The guy absolutely rejects scientific evidence. I mean, just out and out refutes it. He believes that will is the important idea, and his country is now second largest death toll of COVID in the world. And there are others like them. The problem with history and the problem with events is that even though it's logical to say, my God, stop, enough stupidity already, let's move on to something sensible, history doesn't necessarily flow in the rational direction. If it did, we never would have had Trump in the first place. So we're in a danger zone right now where when there is instability, it's really possible to go from bad to worse. And the fact that there's battles out on the streets right now, well, the positive side is that we have more and more Americans speaking out against injustice. And this is certainly for the good. The fact that we could be in open conflict is very real. The fact that gun purchases in the United States are soaring right now is a sign of the pathology of our culture and our political culture. So no predictions about, no guarantees that this will lead people to wake up to the miserable quality of the leadership of these nationalistic, demagogic dividers. They're all around. They are dangerous for the world. And we absolutely need to move beyond them. But there's no guarantee that we will. We have to work hard to get there.
Okay, great. Question now from Neha, doing an MBA at INSEAD. Neha asks, to what extent has the pandemic affected or accelerated the integration of sustainability and ESG metrics into the global economic recovery and asset repricing?
Good question. At a formal level, I would say that the discussions in recent weeks at a serious level in a lot of places is, what does a green recovery look like? And in fact, it's basically, what does a green and digital recovery look like? Because there's a growing appreciation that the digital pillar of the economy is not incidental, but rather fundamental. And can actually, I think, fit very well with a greener recovery in addition. So I'm encouraged by the amount of discussion that's underway in different national capitals and in different regional groupings about the need for the right kind of recovery. In Europe, this is all around the European Green Deal. And I'm quite pleased with the initiative of Chancellor Merkel and President Macron for a European recovery fund of about 750 billion euros at the European-wide level, something really new, quantitatively at least, to fund Europe at a larger scale. And what we need is that kind of cooperation. I'm involved, as I mentioned briefly, in efforts to create a greener Belt and Road initiative, because that's a major infrastructure program, potentially trillions of dollars of important infrastructure, but not especially green infrastructure at this point. China is financing a lot of coal-fired power plants, for example, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and it should definitely not be doing so. So now we have the opportunity to get these metrics in and to insist, why should we recover in assets that are only going to have to be stranded once again? It's interesting, by the way, just yesterday, or I think it's today actually, that BP wrote down, I didn't read it carefully enough. I think it's $18 billion of assets, projected a lower trend line for fossil fuel prices than in their previous report, and said that all of this accelerates their commitment to moving to a net zero emission company by mid-century. That's important too, when a major company in the oil and gas industry says, not only do we need to change, but we recognize that the circumstances are even more adverse for the fossil fuel trajectory than they were before the epidemic. And they signal that by writing down assets and incurring a significant decline of stock prices today. That also is in line with the ESG metrics being built into the recovery. So nothing decisive yet, but it's a good time to emphasize this theme. We are going to need a public investment-led recovery from this crisis. And the more that it is built on Paris and the SDGs, the more robust it's going to be.
Great. Here's a follow-up on what you were discussing earlier. A question from Max, doing computer science at Imperial. Max asks, what do you think is the future of the relationship between China and the US?
Well, it should be normal, cooperative, peaceful, and rule-based. But none of those adjectives applies right now, mainly because of a mindset issue in the United States, which is that American foreign policy after World War II, and is then, I would say, again reinforced after the end of the Cold War in 1992, has been based on the idea of U.S. primacy or hegemonic control of the international system. So from a U.S. neoconservative foreign policy perspective, the U.S. foreign policy is one in which there is a U.S.-led world. And that is the basis of U.S. institutional direction and statecraft. And that idea has bipartisan support, both Democrats and Republicans. This is the basic underpinning of U.S. foreign policy till today, but it is misguided fundamentally. In my opinion, because the U.S. does not and cannot have primacy the way that U.S. policymakers believe that it should and can have. And that's because the U.S. has no monopoly on advanced technologies, and the U.S. economy has no dominance in the world, though the U.S. dollar is still the most important global currency, and U.S. finance is still important, and U.S. technology is still important. The dominance of the U.S. in the international economic system has diminished considerably. So here comes China, a country of 1.4 billion people, almost 20% of the world population, and they're developing and have developed to a point that they are, in per capita terms, maybe about a third of the U.S. GDP per person, but with more than 4 times the U.S. population, now a larger economy than the U.S. And this is freaking out U.S. neoconservative policymakers. Oh my God, there is a rival, there's a competitor. And this is getting written into a script quite quickly that not only is China a competitor, but we face a struggle to the death, that China is out to subvert the essence of the international system, and that it's out to do harm to the United States rather than to merely do good for itself. And so what we're seeing is a growing confrontation between a U.S.-held view of primacy and a global reality of multipolarity. My own view of this is a multipolar system is desirable because it means more and more of the world is benefiting from modern technology and the benefits of that it brings economically and socially. But from the U.S. neoconservative perspective, it's just a danger. And this is the essence of Trump's attempts in recent years to hinder China's development. It's really out of the playbook that the U.S. used vis-a-vis the Soviet Union starting in 1947. Of course, there are many, many differences historically and geopolitically, but in the US mindset, conservative mindset, or neoconservative mindset, or nationalistic mindset, or hegemonic mindset, excuse me, China is a threat and needs to be stopped. And the rhetoric has turned more and more heated. China's an enemy. China is perfidious. China's evil. We're wonderful, and so on. And that is very dangerous self-image, very provocative, and very self-fulfilling, because if you want to turn someone into an enemy, treat them like an enemy. They'll become an enemy over time. So I'm very much afraid that we're on a self-fulfilling course of China becoming an enemy of the United States. And Trump, as you've heard, not my favorite president, my least favorite president in history, is trying to bring Europe, India, Korea, Australia into a new alliance to surround China, a G7 plus 4, adding in India, Korea, Australia, into and Russia, into an anti-China alliance. To my mind, it's all a bit of madness, either crazy to believe in it or dangerous if it actually materialized. And yet, this is really what American policy is. So the answer to the question, Max, is there is no determinate path. In my view, there is a perfectly cooperative approach forward. I do not view China as an international imperialist, expansionist, hegemonic power, though I hear from American neoconservatives that without any evidence that that's what it is, but I don't believe it. And so I believe that we should have a cooperative approach that could be very fruitful and based on the precepts of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both of which China and the US are adherents and signatories, and that would be the way forward. But I'm afraid that we're on a different tack right now. What worries me is that while Trump is nuts, in my view, there's a lot of the American policy establishment that buys into this us versus them mentality. And therefore, even without Trump, this is not so safe. And there isn't a great will to cooperation right now, which there should be.
Wow, thank you very much for that. Question from Olivia, doing history at Yale. Olivia asks, do you think there is a genuine danger of Trump's rejection of bodies such as the WHO setting a lasting precedent? Are you concerned about the future of multilateralism?
I think we have to be concerned about the future of multilateralism because it is inherently a fragile set of institutions. And we have had only 2 real experiments of multilateralism. They are 100 years old in experimentation. The first one, the League of Nations, lasted 25 years, basically, and then was supplanted by the United Nations. The League of Nations, some historians describe as being stillborn because the US of course, failed to join after Woodrow Wilson's failures to get the U.S. Senate to ratify the treaty creating the League of Nations. And this was a huge setback. And the League of Nations ultimately failed to underpin peace, and is now essentially remembered only as the failure that became the progenitor of the United Nations. The UN is a fragile institution, actually. I devote a lot of my effort over the last 20 years to the UN. I'm a believer in it. It was created by the US in its finest moment by our finest president, Franklin Roosevelt. But now you have the Republican Party and Trump overtly disdaining the UN and fighting it. And so the reminders of the League of Nations are obvious in this context. I get to listen to that idiot president of mine once a year at the General Assembly blasting the concepts of multilateralism and globalization. I mean, I view him as a buffoon, but he's not a buffoon. He's more dangerous than that. And he's out to weaken the UN in every way. Last week, extraordinarily, the US threatened sanctions on the International Criminal Court, no less, because the International Criminal Court, these US officials, including Trump, feel might find charges of crimes against humanity by US actors in military battlegrounds in Afghanistan or elsewhere. And so now we're threatening the ICC. We've withdrawn from WHO. We've withdrawn from UNESCO. We have cut America's contributions, forced the UN budget down, attacked the UN in vulgar ways, ignored the UN repeatedly, whether in the Iraq War or in ending the US participation in the Iran nuclear agreement or walking out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So you got to worry a lot. And let me add one more piece of worry, and that's that the UN needs reform. It really needs reform, especially in the Security Council, because the UN has its 75th birthday this year. It was based on giving special prerogatives to 5 permanent members. Of course, the UK, US, Germany, UK, US, France, Russia, or what was then the Soviet Union, and China. And that was the picture of the victors at the end of World War II, but it's a very funny picture of the world right now, not an adequate one. And so we need reform. But of course, the P5, one of the deals was that they have veto power over any change. And so there's been 20 years of discussion about how to reform the UN Security Council to no avail, because one or another of the P5 oppose changes. So all of this is to say that multilateralism is a crucial idea. I think it is the most important idea for keeping the peace, especially in a thermonuclear age. It's vital for being able to stop a pandemic, being able to coordinate on fighting climate change, and all of the issues that I've mentioned under the Sustainable Development Goals. But it's very, very fragile. And just to finally top it off, finance is a major problem, because to make any agglomeration politically work, any federation or confederation or a global multilateralism work, there has to be resources behind it. And this is also a profound sticking point. The whole UN budget, the core budget, is $3 billion a year, roughly. It's nothing. It's a pittance for the organizations at the center of global peace and safety. Of course, there's more that's added on in peacekeeping and in discretionary budgets, but basically we don't fund global public goods adequately at all. And this is itself a fundamental problem. It's why Europe is having such a great difficulty as well, because there's a terrible, terrible fight over a budget that comes to 1% of the gross domestic product of the Union. And yet it's incredible what people are able to fight over when it's fractions of 1% of the respective income of the political grouping. So unless we get proper financing behind multilateralism, it also becomes, to some extent, just an empty letter as well. So my view is it's vital for us. We have to do everything to make it work. It's always fragile. It's even more fragile now.
Very interesting. A question from Femi doing physics at KCL. Femi says, the pandemic has highlighted deep-lying systemic inequalities, and there have been concerns that the fourth industrial revolution will exacerbate this. What can be done by countries to address this? Just to be clear, the fourth industrial revolution refers to the technological revolution.
Yeah, Femi, I think the dramatic digitalization of the economy is the perfect example of this. I'm, in general, in favor of this, in that I'm a believer that what we're getting out of the digital revolution is potentially hugely positive. Better lives, cleaner air, more leisure time, more effective approaches to lots of economic activities, better environmental management through remote sensing, smart systems, AI, precision agriculture, better healthcare, more social inclusion, and so on. That is the hope, the optimistic hope of the fourth industrial revolution. The reality, though, is that like every technological change, going back to the steam engine and the power loom that got the first industrial revolution started, the distributional implications are huge. And just as we had the Luddites smashing the power looms in the 1820s because it was taking jobs away from the weavers and the spinners, now we have massive loss of jobs coming from digitalization. I think we're going to see upheaval in most sectors of the economy. Definitely retail is already experiencing massive job loss as to the more efficient e-commerce. Office work will never be the same, in my view, because it doesn't have to be the same. Why go every day on a long commute into an office when maybe that can be done 2 days a week or 3 days a week, but not every day, and the rest of the time can be spared from commuting and more pleasant work-life balance. I think our education is also going to shift. I'm in favor of campuses, but especially Oxford is very nice. I like Cambridge. I like Cambridge, US and UK, and I like Columbia. But you know, we can also do a lot of interesting things online as well, and I'm sure that education will partly shift in this direction. Definitely the payment system, definitely how we get our driver's license, most likely, and I hope and think should, how we vote in the future, how we participate politically in the future. So all of this is to say I'm in favor of that, but clearly the there's a huge cost of traditional tasks and jobs that come from this, and that was already being felt because robotics, AI, smart systems can do things that replace work that is either manual or I would say requiring less educational attainment. And that was widening inequalities already. Now it's going to tremendously exacerbate inequalities. So we need to move, if this is going to work, we need to move to a system that redefines jobs, that shares, by the way, the leisure time that these technologies can afford, because the idea is not to keep all the work we're doing, but to reorient it, but to use some of this for other pursuits other than our market incomes, and to dissociate more our standard of living from the market returns, the idea of universal basic income or 100 different variants of it, universal access to this, that, and the other service. And so this is what needs to be constructively designed now. How do you use the best of the digital economy, by the way, while preserving freedom and some privacy and some resilience of the system? How do you do all of that and anticipating the unequal weight that will be felt by different occupations to create a more rather than less equal set of outcomes in this kind of activity? That, I think, is a huge challenge, and it really is the constructive work of economics and related disciplines in the coming years. But it's also a huge political challenge. In the US, who has had the biggest gain of wealth over a short period of time in human history since the crisis began? Jeffrey Bezos. Amazon stock has soared, and Mr. Bezos has had a growth of wealth on the order of $35 billion since basically February. That's a lot of dough, by the way. So we've seen before our eyes a massive, massive concentration of wealth occurring. It's not just Bezos, it's the billionaires more generally. Zuckerberg's up only $10 billion in this period. But the billionaires as a whole have seen soaring income at the same time that a significant part of the population has lost jobs that will not return. And so this becomes a core part of the new political economy that we face. There are solutions, but they have to be designed. They are not market solutions. They are social solutions. And so this is what we're going to have to work on and promote.
Okay, got a question here from Lucy doing psychology at Oxford. Lucy asks, COVID has forced us to profoundly change our lifestyles and thus the economy. Which changes do you think will persist on local or global levels, given that they weren't by choice?
Well, I think, two big issues in front of us. One is, will we still be moving towards a more global society, or will this pandemic, as it's both locked us up in the confines of our own homes and neighborhoods, lead to the end of long supply chains and more animosity, more doubts, and so forth. So one is, will our world become more local as a result of this? And second, what I've been talking about in just the recent minutes, how will our the nature of our daily lives change from this epidemic. And my own preference is that we remain globally connected, that we see the truth of this as in so many other areas, the pandemic has shown our common challenges, our common risks, our needs to learn from each other, not grounds for conflict, but grounds for cooperation. And from the point of view of our daily lives, that we have been thrown into a more digital world. And as I've said, I think it can be actually a constructive improvement on our lives if we think about what we want from it. We don't want to be sitting at home on video conferences forever after, never seeing our friends and family and neighbors again, and colleagues. But on the other hand, there are parts of this change that are desirable. I was speaking just very recently with somebody who is working from home, lives in New Jersey, works in downtown New York, and was commuting an hour and a half each way every day, 3-hour commute to get to work. And suddenly no commute at all, but the work is going on just fine. And people have adjusted. And I've spoken to lots of enterprises where the workforce is being internationalized as a result of this, in that, okay, you can work from wherever. You don't have to be local. We're not having office meetings all that often. And so there's an opportunity for really a greatly expanded network of people to be working productively together. So my hope from a crisis like this is that we get the best of what we've been forced into. We understand what we like and what we don't like. We don't want permanent isolation. This will drive us crazy and be against our human nature. But on the other hand, we do like some of the aspects of how our lives have changed potentially. Take away the virus, but allow the changes to persist. That's where I think we ought to head. What we are seeing, though, is something different. Sharply rising tensions, sharply rising inequalities, and a great deal of instability right now. So I wouldn't say that we're naturally moving in the right direction. To get to where we want to get, we're going to have to, as I keep emphasizing, do it consciously. This is what we want collectively from this. This is, in other words, political and social choices that can emerge from this. And that forces us to talk about these changes in terms of their distributional impacts, their fairness, their long-term well-being, their environmental sustainability, because those, I think, need to be the real tests of change.
Great, thank you so much. Just getting growing conscious of time, so figuring maybe time for 2 more questions.
Okay, let's do that.
Brilliant. So second last question here, coming from Jane, who's doing law at UCL. Jane asks, or says, as you noted, we sadly live in a time of poor leadership. As someone who has inspired so many of us, which current or past world leaders and major figures inspire or impress you most?
I told you my favorite president. I'll tell you my 2 favorite. My favorite of all time in the US is Franklin Roosevelt. And part of this lockdown, I watched the documentary series by Ken Burns on the Roosevelts, Teddy, Eleanor, and Franklin. And I knew a lot of the story, but it was nice to watch, and it was beautiful to watch, and it was inspiring again to watch. Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor had incredible character. And I'm a believer that character counts. I am philosophically an Aristotelian. I follow Aristotle's ethical approach. And Aristotle's ethical approach is a good society is built on virtues or character. And the character of leaders matters a lot, in my view. And Roosevelt had great character, a bravery and a decency and an intelligence to find good, wise colleagues to help him see his way through very, very deep crises. And so I think we can I take a lot of inspiration from that example. And indeed, it is not a cliche to say that it's almost unbelievable that Roosevelt was able to surmount the polio personally that made his legs almost useless. And from the depths of that to become governor of New York, a great reforming governor, and then 4-term winner of presidential elections and the longest serving president in our history, and presiding over the Great Depression and the victory in World War II and inventing the UN to boot. Not bad. During my lifetime, my favorite president has been John F. Kennedy. And I wrote a book a few years ago about what I regard as Kennedy's finest moment. He had 2 first somewhat shaky years in his global statecraft, and almost the disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis ending the world in October 1962. But he learned from that, and in his last year of life became a statesman of the first order in negotiating the first major agreement with the Soviet Union, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And Kennedy had a deep sense of the common humanity and the common aspirations of humanity not to blow ourselves up. And so he understood at the most crucial moment in history the need to find a path to peace, and did so absolutely magnificently. And again, showed, and this is what I wrote about in this book, To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace, that peace was not just something that happened. It's not a balance of power or just an equilibrium. It's something you construct. You have to imagine the future the way you want it. And then you have to think hard and act upon those thoughts about how to construct that world. So Kennedy realized after the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we needed to step back from the brink of potential mass annihilation, and came up with a roadmap politically and geopolitically how to accomplish it, and then used his great eloquence and the great eloquence of his speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen, to help bring this about, and succeeded. And many people think, and I have come to be among them, that it was Kennedy's quest for peace that led to his assassination in November '63, possibly by renegade CIA-linked conspiracy. And I think it's pretty plausible from what I know. But in any event, even beside that, I think he, in some sense, either metaphorically or literally, gave his life for the cause of peace, and did a phenomenal job doing that. So that's inspiration, and it's the kind of leadership we need to help find and bring about. When Trump was running, of course, many people said, this is a despicable man, but it's not really his personal character that matters. I like him because he's going to do X, Y, and Z. But of course, leadership without character is a risk. Leadership with disastrous character, psychopathic character like Trump, is a risk to the world. And that's why we need to pay attention to the character of our leaders.
Very interesting. Final question now from Chen, doing economics at Warwick. Chen says, thanks for such a stimulating talk. What advice do you have for future generations and budding economists wanting to contribute to sustainability as a career to fix global ills?
Good, Chen, good question. And thanks for the nice words. First, do it. So I got involved in economics, I will tell you, shockingly, 48 years ago, actually 48 years ago this summer. I graduated high school, and I went to see a pen pal of mine in East Berlin, a very nice man that I recently saw again after several decades. And I spent a couple of weeks in East Berlin and experienced the socialism of the German Democratic Republic at the time, and the very warm, nice hospitality of my pen pal and his family, and was just filled with questions. Oh my God, what is this system? What is this alternative system? What is capitalism? What is socialism? I didn't know what those words meant, even though I was a high school graduate and supposedly knew something. I knew very little about my own society and less about the world, and had big questions in mind, and decided to go into economics because I wanted to look at the question, what would make for a good society? What is the right thing to do? Turned out, I've spent 48 years working on that question. I've learned something along the way. It's a good question, and it has kept me motivated, and I have not been disappointed for a day about the choice I made about what I wanted to think about during my lifetime, and the problems that I wanted to work on. So I say that just as one piece of advice, if I might, which is work on things that really interest you and that are going to captivate you and engage the best of you, and will do so because they're important things to work on. And I think that is the most important advice that I could give in terms of professional choice. I'm very skeptical of the argument, well, I'm going to make some money and that's going to give me the independence to do X, Y, and Z, because I don't think that usually turns out so well for the person wanting that kind of instrumental approach. I think the approach that says, I'm just fascinated by X and it seems really interesting and important, that's what I want to work on. Now, having said that, sustainability is a great, big, interconnected field. We've talked about technology, we've talked about public health, we've talked about climate change, we've talked about inequality, and so on. They're all part of this interconnected idea of sustainable development. So you can work on any aspects of them. And during my own career, I've worked on many of them in different phases. Intense periods working on public health, and then intense periods working on climate change, and then intense periods working on economic development, or periods of working on questions of poverty alleviation, and so on. One of my advisors, not quite 50 years ago, but more than 40 years ago, said to me that one of his strategies was to work on topics for a few years and then consciously to learn some other area. And I took that to heart because I found that good advice. And I found that being in quotation marks, an endless graduate student is a good gig also. So constantly broadening your reach, I have found to be very exciting. And since in sustainable development, everything really is linked to everything else, trying to understand that span is useful. Final point that I would make, just as a technical matter, you're in economics at Warwick, which is great place to be. I think economics as a field working on the material dimension of life, resources and their uses, absolutely requires a partnership with other disciplines, with engineering, with the earth sciences, with public health, with psychology and neuroscience, and so forth. So I found in economics, for me, over many decades, that it is working across fields with others that has been probably the most rewarding and the most illuminating for me as an economist, to be able to deepen the understanding of what is supposed to be my comparative advantage, at least, by having it clarified through the eyes of other fields and other intellectual disciplines and approaches. So I've really enjoyed the interdisciplinarity of work as a basic approach. So find what you're interested in, and what you are interested in is a very good thing to be interested in, contributing to sustainability. Work hard at it. Can't give any other advice than that. And let your interests continue to, and your curiosity continue to drive you. And I'm sure that you will make a very important contribution.
Thank you so much. On that inspiring note, thank you very much again, Professor Sachs, for sharing so much of your time and your fascinating insights and advice with us. Thank you also to everyone for watching and for all your varied questions. We look forward to welcoming you again all soon in our upcoming events. Thank you and goodbye.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Great to be with you.